The wind howled through the abandoned streets, rattling broken windows and pushing debris along the cracked pavement. A single street lamp flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced against the cold, crumbling walls. The world had changed, no longer bustling with life, no longer predictable. The old rules were gone, replaced by something much darker. Inside a dimly lit basement, a small group huddled together, their breaths shallow, their eyes filled with fear. They weren't just hiding from the outside world. They were hiding from what the world had become. The once safe society they had known was now a hunting ground, and those who refused to conform were the hunted. Sarah clutched her son, Micah, close to her chest, her fingers tightening around his thin shoulders. He was barely 10, but his eyes carried a weight no child should bear. Beside her, Mark shifted uneasily, his hands gripping the edge of an old wooden crate. He had always been the strong one, the protector, but even he looked drained. The sleepless nights, the constant paranoia, it was wearing him down. "It's quiet," whispered Rachel, her voice barely audible. She was the youngest of the group, barely out of her teens, but she had seen enough to strip away any innocence she once had. "Too quiet," Mark muttered. He stood up and approached the narrow basement window, careful to keep himself hidden in the shadows. Outside, the world was still. It had been days since they last saw the patrols, but that didn't mean they were safe. It only meant the danger was harder to see. Sarah's heart pounded as she held Micah tighter. They had been on the run for months, moving from one safe house to another, always just a step ahead of the enforcers. The government had changed, no longer a system of laws, but a machine of control. Faith was no longer a freedom, it was a crime, and those who refused to surrender to the new order were marked. Some were taken, others simply disappeared. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, gripping the cross pendant hidden beneath her jacket. She had lost her family early on. They had trusted the system, believed the promises. She had watched as they were led away, never to return. The memory haunted her, fueling the fire inside her to keep going, to fight for something greater. "We can't stay here forever," she said, opening her eyes again. "They'll find us eventually." Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I know, we need a plan. But rushing out there without a solid one is suicide." Micah stirred in his mother's arms. "Are we ever going to be safe again?" His voice was small, hopeful yet uncertain. Sarah kissed the top of his head, swallowing the lump in her throat. "One day," she whispered, "one day we will." The sound of distant footsteps froze them in place. Heavy boots against concrete. Slow, deliberate. Mark's eyes met Sarah's, and in that silent exchange, the message was clear. They had been found. Rachel's hands trembled as she reached for the hidden hatch beneath the floorboards, their only escape route. But was there enough time? A sharp knock echoed through the silence. Then another. Micah buried his face in his mother's chest, his small body trembling. Sarah stroked his back, her own fear barely contained. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched. Then a voice, calm, almost gentle. "We know you're in there." The air in the room turned suffocating. Mark's fists clenched. Rachel swallowed hard. There was no more time to run, no more time to hide. The choice was upon them. And whatever came next would change everything. Mark barely breathed. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the silence that had fallen over the room. The voice outside was patient, steady. Not shouting, not demanding, just waiting. That was worse. It meant they weren't in a hurry. It meant they were sure. Sarah held Micah so close she could feel the rapid rise and fall of his tiny chest. She wanted to whisper something to him, something to keep him calm, but her throat was dry. Rachel had already moved to the hatch, her fingers fumbling with the edge of the loose floorboard. They had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now that it was real, every movement felt slow, clumsy. The knock came again, firmer this time. "You don't have to be afraid." The voice was smooth, almost reassuring. "Come out and we can talk." Mark's grip on the knife in his hand tightened. It was useless against the weapons they carried, but he held it anyway. A last defense, a last stand. Rachel managed to pry open the hatch just enough to see the tunnel beneath. It was damp, narrow, but it led to the alley behind the building. Their way out. Then the doorknob turned. Sarah sucked in a sharp breath. Locked. Thank God they had locked it. But locks wouldn't hold forever. A pause. Then the sound of footsteps retreating slightly. Murmured voices outside. More than one of them. "We have to move," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Rachel nodded and slipped down first, landing softly. She reached up to help Micah as Sarah guided him through. His small body disappeared into the darkness below. Mark glanced at the door one last time. He could hear movement, the faint hum of something mechanical. They were cutting through. Sarah climbed down, gripping Micah tightly against her as Rachel steadied her from below. Mark was the last. He slid the floorboard back just as the door handle rattled again. This time harder. Then they ran. The tunnel was damp and narrow, barely enough space to move at a full sprint. The air smelled of mildew and rusted metal, but none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was distance. Rachel led the way, her memory sharp despite the panic pressing against them. She had mapped this escape weeks ago, knowing the day would come when they had no other choice. Behind them, a distant crash, the door giving way. Then voices. They're gone. A moment of silence. Then the sound of boots hitting the floor above them. "They found the tunnel," Mark whispered. Sarah squeezed Micah's hand tighter. "Keep going." The end of the tunnel was just ahead, a rusted metal grate covering the exit. Rachel reached it first, shoving at the bars with all her strength. The metal groaned, unwilling to give. "No, no, no," she muttered, desperation rising in her throat. Mark shoved beside her, bracing himself against the tunnel walls and kicking at the grate. Footsteps in the tunnel, getting closer. Then, with a final, ear-splitting creak, the metal gave way. Rachel scrambled up first, pulling Micah with her as Sarah followed. Mark was last again, pausing only for a second to glance back down the tunnel. A beam of light cut through the darkness. They were almost there. Mark hoisted himself up, landing on the damp pavement just as the voices in the tunnel grew clearer. Go. They ran. The alley was tight, lined with rusted dumpsters and old forgotten debris. The city had fallen into disrepair, the once proud buildings now worn and tired. A place where shadows stretched long and danger lurked around every corner. Rachel took the lead again, weaving through the maze of empty streets. They couldn't go back to the shelter. They had to find somewhere new. But the city was closing in around them. Distant sirens wailed, a low, eerie sound that sent chills through Sarah's spine. She didn't know if they were for them, but she wasn't about to wait and find out. Micah stumbled, his small legs struggling to keep up. Sarah scooped him into her arms without slowing, ignoring the burn in her muscles. Mark glanced over his shoulder. No sign of pursuit yet, but it wouldn't be long. They knew this part of the city better than anyone. Rachel veered left suddenly, leading them into an abandoned storefront. The glass had been shattered long ago, leaving jagged edges framing the doorway. Inside, dust coated the empty shelves, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. She motioned for them to stay low as she crept toward the back, peering out through a broken panel in the rear door. Mark crouched beside her, keeping his breathing steady. "What do you see?" Rachel hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the doorframe. "They're searching, a few streets over." "Do they know where we went?" A pause. "Not yet." Sarah knelt beside Micah, brushing the hair from his face. He was pale, exhausted. This life was breaking him. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered. "We can't keep running forever." Mark turned toward her, his expression hard but understanding. "We don't have a choice." Rachel pulled away from the door, her face set in determination. "We have to find a way out of the city." Mark exhaled sharply. "You know the borders are locked down." "There are ways," she said quietly. "But they're risky." Sarah looked down at Micah. He'd fallen asleep against her, his small body rising and falling in rhythm with her own breaths. "We have to try," she said. Mark nodded. "Then we need to find someone who can help us." Rachel's gaze darkened. "I might know someone." Outside, the city continued its slow descent into silence. For now they had a moment, but the hunt wasn't over. And time was running out. Night had settled over the city, draping the streets in shadows that stretched long and deep. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and something else, something more sinister. Silence wasn't safety here. It was a warning. The fewer sounds there were, the more dangerous the night became. Inside the abandoned store, the group remained still, barely daring to breathe. The tension hung heavy between them, unspoken but understood. Rachel sat near the back door, her fingers tracing invisible patterns against the dust-covered floor. She was thinking. Planning. Mark watched her closely, his instincts telling him she wasn't just trying to find a way out. She was weighing the risks. Sarah adjusted Micah in her arms. He had barely stirred since they stopped, his small body curled into her like he was trying to disappear. He deserved more than this life. They all did. Mark finally spoke, his voice low. "Who do you know?" Rachel hesitated before answering. "An old contact. Someone who used to work inside the system before everything changed. If he's still around, he might have a way to get us past the border." Sarah tensed. "Might." Rachel's expression darkened. "Last time I saw him, he was already on thin ice. Helping people escape. That's a death sentence." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "So he could be gone. Or he could be our only shot." Silence stretched between them. They had heard the stories. People who tried to escape, people who never made it. Some were caught and dragged back. Others simply vanished, erased from existence like they had never been there at all. Sarah's arms tightened around Micah. "Where is he?" Rachel took a breath, steadying herself. "Near the industrial district. If he's still using the same safe house, it's at an old train depot." Mark exhaled sharply. "That's across the city." "And crawling with patrols," Sarah added. Rachel's jaw tightened. "I know, but unless you have a better idea." Mark didn't. None of them did. The decision was made in silence. There was no debate, no argument. Just understanding. They would go. Rachel led the way, slipping out through the back alley, her body moving with practiced precision. Mark followed, staying close to Sarah as she held Micah, his small arms wrapped tightly around her neck. The city had changed in ways that made it feel less like a place and more like a trap. The buildings loomed taller, their windows shattered like empty eyes watching from above. Streets that had once been filled with life were now vacant, stripped of anything that made them feel real. They moved carefully, avoiding open areas, ducking behind rusted cars and piles of debris. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every distant noise sent their hearts pounding. As they neared the industrial district, Rachel motioned for them to stop. She crouched low behind an overturned dumpster, scanning the area ahead. Mark dropped beside her, his gaze following hers. A checkpoint. Two enforcers stood by the entrance of an old overpass, their weapons slung across their chests. A barricade had been set up, blocking the street with a row of steel barriers. Beyond them, the city stretched toward the depot, dark and unwelcoming. Mark cursed under his breath. We can't go through. Rachel nodded. We go around. Sarah swallowed hard. Where? Rachel hesitated. The overpass was the safest direct route, but that wasn't an option. The alternative was worse. The drainage tunnels, she said finally. Sarah stiffened. You're serious. It's the only way, Rachel said. They won't expect anyone to go through there. It's too unstable. Mark exhaled, rubbing his temple. Because it could collapse. Rachel met his gaze. And if we stay up here, we get caught. Another silent decision. They moved fast, keeping to the edges of the street until they reached a rusted grate, half buried in debris. Mark and Rachel pried it open, the metal groaning in protest. A rush of stale air hit them as they peered inside. The tunnel was narrow dark, the ground slick with standing water. Sarah hesitated only a second before stepping in, holding Micah close. Rachel followed, then Mark, pulling the grate shut behind them. The tunnel swallowed them in darkness. The air was damp, thick with the scent of decay. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing in the distance. The walls were lined with rusted pipes, some leaking, others cracked beyond repair. Rachel moved first, her flashlight barely cutting through the blackness. Stay close, she whispered. They walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by the wet ground. The tunnel stretched far beneath the city, winding in ways that made it easy to get lost. Sarah held Micah tighter. How much farther? Rachel didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know. Then the noise came. A distant clatter. Rachel froze. Mark pulled Sarah and Micah close against the wall, his body tense. Then another noise. Closer this time. Not just echoes. Someone else was in the tunnel. Rachel flicked off the flashlight. The darkness became absolute. The sound of movement grew louder. Slow, deliberate steps. A breath. Not theirs. Sarah felt Micah's small hands clutch her jacket, his body trembling. Rachel's fingers closed around the small knife she carried. Mark reached for the pipe strapped to his back. Then a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. You shouldn't be here. Rachel's heart slammed against her ribs. The voice wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was warning them. Then another sound. Behind them. A scraping noise, metal against stone. Sarah turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Something moved in the darkness. And they weren't alone. The air in the tunnel was thick, almost suffocating. Rachel's grip tightened around the handle of her knife, her pulse hammering in her ears. The voice had come from somewhere close, too close. And now the silence was worse than the sound itself. Mark shifted slightly, his body tense, the pipe in his hand steady. Sarah held Micah against her, his breath warm against her neck, his small fingers digging into her sleeve. She could feel his heartbeat, fast and terrified, mirroring her own. Then the voice came again, soft, uneasy. You have to go back. Rachel's eyes adjusted to the dark, barely making out the figure just a few steps ahead. A man. Thin, his clothes torn and damp from the tunnels. He wasn't one of them, but he wasn't a soldier either. Mark stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Who are you? The man hesitated. Doesn't matter. You can't go this way. Rachel's mind raced. Was he a trap? A warning? Or something worse? Sarah swallowed hard. Why? The man glanced behind him, his head jerking slightly, like he was listening for something. They come through here, he said, his voice lower now. Not often, but when they do. He trailed off, shaking his head. Rachel felt a chill creep up her spine. Who? The man's breathing quickened. Enforcers, not the ones in uniform. The other ones. Mark exchanged a look with Rachel. They had heard whispers before, about the ones that weren't on patrol, the ones who worked in the dark, cleaning up the resistance. Rachel took a slow step forward, keeping her voice steady. How do you know? The man exhaled shakily. Because I've seen them. His voice wavered. And I'm the only one left. Sarah's arms tightened around Micah. What happened? The man's eyes darted past them, toward the way they came. They don't chase. They don't need to. He took a step closer. They trap you. They wait. His hands trembled as he spoke. I've been here for days, maybe weeks. I don't know anymore. I thought I was the only one left. Mark's jaw clenched. If they come here, why are you still alive? The man swallowed hard. Because I don't move. I don't make a sound. His gaze shifted to Micah. But you have a child. Rachel's stomach twisted. The tunnel suddenly felt smaller. Mark moved first. We're leaving. The man grabbed his arm, desperation in his grip. No, he hissed. They'll hear. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. A noise. Not footsteps, not voices, something else. A deep low hum vibrating against the stone walls. Faint at first, but growing. The man went rigid, his fingers digging into Mark's sleeve. It's too late. Rachel's heart pounded. Run. They turned, sprinting back through the tunnel, their footsteps splashing through the shallow water. The air grew heavier, pressing in on them, as if the tunnel itself was alive. Micah whimpered, burying his face in Sarah's shoulder, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Behind them, the hum grew louder. A deep, unnatural sound that crawled into their bones. Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, but there was nothing, just darkness swallowing everything behind them. Then the man screamed. Rachel didn't look back. The tunnel twisted, turning into another passage, and suddenly there was light, faint, flickering from above. An old maintenance grate. Mark reached it first, jumping onto the metal rungs and climbing. Rachel was right behind him. Sarah shoved Micah up first. Mark caught him, hoisting him through the gap. Sarah followed, her muscles burning as she climbed, her breath ragged. Rachel scrambled up last, pushing herself through just as something shifted in the tunnel below. She slammed the grate shut. They collapsed onto the damp pavement above, gasping for air. The city was silent again. The tunnels hidden beneath their feet. Rachel's hands trembled as she pushed herself up. Mark did the same, checking Sarah, then Micah. They were alive, but something was wrong. The city wasn't as they had left it. There were no patrols, no sirens, no movement at all. And in the distance, beyond the crumbling skyline, the sky itself seemed different. Sarah held Micah close, staring at the horizon. Rachel exhaled sharply. We need to move. Mark nodded, but his eyes were still fixed on the city ahead. Because whatever was coming, it had already begun. The wind had changed. Rachel felt it first, a shift in the air that prickled against her skin. The city ahead stood eerily still, its usual distant noises replaced by an unnatural quiet. Even the flickering streetlights, the ones that had always cast their sickly glow over the abandoned districts, were gone. Just darkness stretching between the hollow buildings. Mark stood beside her, his breath slow, controlled, but she could see the tension in his stance. Sarah, still holding Micah tightly, glanced up at him, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But he was just as frozen as the rest of them. Then came the noise. Not from the tunnels this time. From above. A low mechanical hum vibrated through the air, deep and steady, like a pulse running through the city itself. Rachel's stomach tightened. It wasn't a patrol. It wasn't the usual search drones. This sound was something new. Mark's fingers curled into a fist. We need to get off the street. Rachel's eyes darted across the empty road, searching for any cover. The buildings that lined the street were gutted, hollowed out by time and war. But there, just ahead, an old factory. The doors were broken, the inside shrouded in shadows. It would have to do. Move. They ran, keeping low, their footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. Rachel reached the entrance first, slipping through the jagged opening where a door had once stood. Mark followed, then Sarah, carefully cradling Micah as they disappeared into the darkness. The factory was massive, a skeletal structure of rusted beams and shattered glass. Machines sat lifeless, their surfaces coated in dust and neglect. The scent of oil and metal clung to the air, stale but familiar. Rachel pressed herself against the wall, peering through a broken window. The humming sound grew louder, and then she saw it. A light in the sky. Not a drone, not a spotlight. Something else. A sharp, piercing beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the city in slow, deliberate motions. Searching. Mark exhaled sharply. That's not normal. Rachel barely heard him. Because something else was wrong. The streets. The buildings. They were different. Not physically, but something was missing. Something small, something they had never questioned before. And then it hit her. The signs, the markings, the ones that had been painted on every wall, every street corner, warnings and orders from the enforcers. The rules, the laws, the symbols of control. They were gone. Erased. Sarah must have noticed too, because her grip on Micah tightened. What does this mean? Rachel shook her head. I don't know. Mark turned from the window. We can't stay here. We have to find your contact. If the city's changing, we need to know why. Rachel hesitated. Her contact, the man who might have answers, the man who might already be dead. She thought of the tunnels, the warning from the stranger. They don't chase. They wait. She swallowed hard. If he's still alive, he'll be at the depot. Mark didn't argue. He just nodded. Then we move now. Rachel took one last glance at the street before pulling away from the window. The searchlight was still scanning, slow and methodical, but it wasn't looking for them. It was looking for something else. They slipped back into the night, staying close to the alleys, weaving through the silent city. Rachel kept her senses sharp, scanning every shadow, every broken doorway. But no one was there. The city was empty. And that was the problem. The enforcers had been everywhere, always. And now they were just gone. The depot loomed ahead, its massive steel doors rusted, but still standing. The air smelled of smoke and old metal, the remnants of a forgotten war. Rachel led them around the side, toward the entrance she knew, or hoped was still there. The door was unlocked. Her stomach twisted. Mark noticed. Trap. Rachel exhaled slowly. Only one way to find out. She pushed the door open. Inside, the depot was dark, the vast space stretching into endless shadows. Stacks of abandoned crates lined the walls, old train cars sitting motionless on rusted tracks. The air felt heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound. A whisper. Not words, just movement. Rachel stiffened. Someone's here. Mark raised his pipe, his eyes scanning the darkness. Sarah pressed herself against the wall. Micah curled against her. Then a light flickered, dim, weak, and a voice. You made it. Rachel turned sharply, her heart slamming against her ribs. A figure stepped forward, his face partially hidden beneath the dim glow of a flickering overhead light. She recognized him immediately. The contact. But something was wrong. His clothes were torn, his hands bruised. His eyes wide, frantic. Mark didn't lower his guard. What happened? The man licked his cracked lips. You don't understand, he whispered. It's already started. Rachel's pulse spiked. What has? The man swallowed hard, glancing toward the depot doors like he expected something to burst through at any second. The system, he said, his voice barely audible. It's not just hunting anymore. He looked at Rachel, his expression hollow. It's changing everything. The word sent a chill through her. The empty streets, the missing signs, the silence. Mark's grip on the pipe tightened. Why? The contact exhaled shakily. Because they don't need control anymore. He took a step forward, his voice urgent. They're done watching, done enforcing. His breathing grew uneven. They're resetting everything. Rachel's stomach dropped. What does that mean? The man looked at her, his expression haunted. It means none of us were ever meant to survive this long. And then from outside the depot, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, measured. Not running. Just approaching. And this time, they weren't alone. The footsteps outside the depot were slow and deliberate, each one echoing through the vast, empty space. Rachel's breath hitched. They weren't searching. They already knew. Mark shifted his grip on the pipe, his body coiled with tension. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, shielding Micah as his small fingers clung to her jacket. The contact, his face pale and damp with sweat, stared toward the entrance, his hands trembling at his sides. Rachel's mind raced. Running wasn't an option. There was nowhere left to go. Then the depot doors groaned. A heavy silence followed, stretching thin, pressing against them like an invisible weight. Then a voice, cold, measured. You've come far. Rachel's pulse hammered in her ears. The voice wasn't unfamiliar. She had heard it before. From the broadcasts, the warnings, the speeches that played across the city when everything first fell apart. Mark went rigid beside her. Sarah turned her face slightly, her expression tightening as the realization sank in. It was him, the one behind it all. The figure stepped into the dim light. He wasn't in uniform. No enforcer gear, no weapons visible. Just a man in a dark coat, calm, composed. His eyes scanned the room with unsettling ease, settling on Rachel first, then Mark, then Sarah and Micah. Then he smiled. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind. It was worse than either. You thought you understood, he said softly, but you never did. Rachel felt something cold settle in her chest. The contact took a shaky step forward. You said the system was resetting, he whispered. What does that mean? The man's smile didn't fade. Exactly what it sounds like. Rachel clenched her fists. You're wiping everything out. His head tilted slightly. Not wiping. Correcting. Mark exhaled sharply. Why now? You've controlled this city for years. Why change the rules? The man's gaze flickered to Mark, as if he was amused by the question. Because control was only the first step. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. You think you've been fighting a system, but the system was never your enemy. Rachel's throat felt tight. Then what is? His smile faded. Time. Rachel stiffened. Mark took a step forward. You're lying. The man shook his head. You've noticed, haven't you? He gestured toward the city beyond the depot. The missing signs, the silent streets, the things that don't quite add up. His eyes darkened. That's not enforcement. That's decay. Rachel's mind spun. The city hadn't just been abandoned. It had been unraveling. The enforcers weren't gone because they had left. They were gone because they were never meant to last. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. What did you do? The man exhaled, almost like he pitied them. You think this world is real, he said. You think you've been fighting for something that still exists. He looked at them, at all of them. But you don't remember the beginning, do you? Rachel opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because he was right. The memories, the way things used to be, were all fragments. Blurred. Faded around the edges. Sarah's grip on Micah tightened. That's not possible. The man took a step closer. Isn't it? Rachel's breath came shallow now. Everything they had been fighting for, every step, every risk, every loss, had been based on the belief that they could change something. That the city, the world, was still theirs to reclaim. But what if it wasn't? What if they were just remnants of something already gone? Micah stirred against Sarah's chest, his small voice barely audible. Mama. The man's gaze softened. Children always sense it first, he murmured. Rachel's stomach twisted. You're lying. He didn't argue. He simply extended his hand. You don't have to fight anymore, he said. None of you do. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. Mark's grip on the pipe tightened. And if we refuse? The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because the depot around them, slowly, quietly, had begun to change. The walls seemed to stretch, the light flickering, shifting. The crates that lined the room blurred at the edges, as if they were fading. No, not fading. Collapsing. Rachel's heartbeat pounded in her ears. What's happening? The man's voice remained steady. The reset. Mark moved first, grabbing Sarah's arm. We have to go. But the door was no longer there. The room was shifting, pulling away like a tide receding, unraveling around them. Rachel turned sharply to the contact, but he was already gone, swallowed by the nothingness creeping in at the edges. Micah whimpered. Sarah pressed him close, her own breath unsteady. Rachel forced herself to move, to think. There has to be a way out. The man's voice, now distant, came one last time. There's only forward. And then the world collapsed. Not into darkness, but into something else entirely. The world didn't shatter. It didn't explode or disappear in a flash of light. It simply shifted. Rachel's feet hit solid ground, but it wasn't the depot floor. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight of everything had lifted, leaving only silence behind. Her vision blurred, her breath shallow, her body struggling to catch up to whatever had just happened. Mark was beside her, his fists still clenched, eyes darting around, searching for a threat. Sarah clutched Micah, rocking him gently, whispering his name over and over. But the boy wasn't crying. He was just staring ahead, wide-eyed, as if he understood something none of them did. The city was gone. No buildings, no streets, no ruins. Just a vast, endless landscape stretching beneath a sky that wasn't quite night or day. Faint colors shimmered in the air, shifting with no clear source of light. The space around them was neither hot nor cold, neither alive nor dead. Rachel swallowed hard. Where are we? Mark's jaw tightened. Not where we were. Sarah turned in slow circles, her face pale. Is this real? Rachel didn't have an answer, but then she saw him. The man from the depot. He stood a few feet away, still calm, still watching them with that same unreadable expression. But something was different now. He wasn't just a shadow in the system anymore. He was part of whatever this place was. Rachel took a step toward him. What did you do? He exhaled softly, almost like he had been expecting that question. I told you the truth. His gaze shifted past her, toward the strange horizon that pulsed like a living thing. This world was never what you thought it was. It was a construct, a place caught in between. Mark took a sharp breath. Between what? The man met his eyes. Endings and beginnings. Sarah tightened her hold on Micah. You mean we were never alive? The man shook his head. You were. And you still are. His voice was patient, steady. But what you called life was only one version of something much larger. Rachel felt something stir deep in her chest, an unsettling mix of fear and understanding. You said the system was resetting. The man nodded, because it had reached the end of its function. He took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning their faces. You weren't supposed to last this long. The ones who created the system never expected resistance. They built a cycle, a loop of control. But when people like you refused to follow the rules, the structure began to break. Mark let out a quiet breath, and now it's gone. The man gave a small, knowing smile. Not gone, just no longer necessary. Rachel's hands curled into fists. So what happens now? The man glanced at Micah, his expression softening slightly. That's the real question, isn't it? He looked back at Rachel. What do you want to happen? The words settled over them like a heavy weight. For so long, they had been running, hiding, surviving. Every decision had been made out of necessity, not choice. But now there were no enforcers, no city walls, no rules telling them where to go or what to do. Rachel's throat tightened. Are we free? The man studied her, as if measuring the depth of her question. That depends. Mark crossed his arms. On what? The man tilted his head slightly. On whether you're ready for what comes next. A soft breeze moved through the strange landscape, and suddenly Rachel saw them. Others. Shapes in the distance, figures appearing like faint echoes, some alone, some in groups, all looking just as lost as they were. Survivors. People who had been trapped in the system just like them. Sarah sucked in a breath. We're not the only ones. The man nodded. You never were. Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat. All this time, they had believed they were fighting a war, that they were up against something unstoppable. But now, standing here in this place beyond the ruins of their world, she realized the truth. They hadn't been fighting to win. They had been fighting to wake up. Rachel turned back to the man. You knew this would happen, didn't you? He gave the faintest smile. I hoped it would. Micah reached for Sarah's hand, his small fingers tightening around hers. Where do we go now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man gestured to the horizon, where the sky pulsed like the edge of a dream. Forward. Rachel glanced at Mark, then Sarah. They had lost so much. Sacrificed everything. But for the first time, there was no fear pressing down on them, no cage keeping them from moving. Just open space. Just possibility. Rachel took a deep breath. Then, without looking back, she stepped forward. And the others followed.